Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today, I'm super excited to introduce you to our latest sewing project, the Celia jacket pattern. It's cool, it's chic, and totally customizable. The Celia is an oversized jacket that combines the timeless look of a denim jacket. Whether you're a beginner or an advanced sewer, you'll find this pattern both fun and rewarding. You can choose any fabric to match your style. Stick with classic denim for a casual look, or go for something like jacquard if you're feeling a bit more adventurous. Ready to make a statement with your sewing skills? Grab your materials and let's get started. Start by measuring and cutting your interlining fabric, making sure it's an exact match to your collar, front and back facing, welt pocket, pocket flap, pocket facing, waistband, and cuff pieces. Gently place the interlining fabric on the wrong side of each piece and press with an iron. Next up, let's grab your front pieces. We're going to work on the wrong side of the fabric for this step. You'll find the area marked on the pattern for the welt pocket. That's where we're going to apply some fusible interlining, but slightly larger than the marking. It's like giving your fabric a little extra strength where it needs it the most. Just line it up carefully with the marked area, and you'll be all set. Now, with the right side of the fabric looking up at you, let's transfer those all-important welt pocket markings from the pattern onto your fabric. Grab your tailor's chalk or a fabric marker, whatever you've got handy, and gently trace over the markings. Make sure they're nice and clear. These are our guides, and don't forget, draw one more line right down the middle to help you align everything perfectly. This little step will make a big difference. Carefully fold the pocket welt piece down its center lengthwise, taking extra care to align the edges precisely. This step is critical for ensuring that the welt is symmetrical and neat. Once the fold is perfectly aligned, press it down gently with an iron. All right, let's get those pocket components ready. First, take one of your welt pieces and align it with the inner pocket marking on the right side of your garment. You'll want the welt seam line to match up just right with the middle line marking. Precision is key here. Once it's perfectly aligned, pin it in place. This will keep it stable and prevent any sneaky shifts while you work. Moving on, it's time to bring in the pocket bag 2 fabric piece. Position its side edge along the side pocket marking line on your garment, with the right sides of the fabrics facing each other. Lay the lining pocket bag piece over the welt, ensuring that the right sides of both the flap and the pocket bag are facing each other. Align these pieces carefully. I like to retrace my markings so I can sew exactly on top of them. Finally, the moment of truth, sewing. Follow the marking lines you made earlier and sew along them. This is where everything comes together, so take it slow and steady. Now let's dive into a crucial step, cutting the center line of your welt pocket. Flip to the wrong side of your garment for this. Carefully follow the center line of your welt pocket guidelines. Cut along this line, but slow down as you approach the edge of the welt pocket. Here comes a bit of a delicate move. Make diagonal cuts towards the corners as you reach the ends. Think of it as guiding your scissors to the very tips of the welt pocket, but be careful not to cut too far. Next, take a deep breath and gently pull the welt, flap, and pocket pieces through the slit you've just created. Once you've got everything through, press it flat. This isn't just for neatness. You're actually forming the opening of your pocket. Take care that the small triangle is pushed to the wrong side of the fabric, and that all the edges of the pocket pieces are aligned. Now separate the fabric pocket bag and sew a top stitch on the right side of the front piece, around the inner and top edges of the pocket, catching the pocket lining and the seam allowance of the welt piece. Top stitch using a 0.1 centimeter seam allowance. Now, let's secure everything together with some pins. Grab your pocket fabric pieces and we're going to pin them right sides together, matching the notches. Pay special attention to those two little triangles at the edges of your welt pocket. Sew them down carefully and then sew around the pocket pieces, using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Your welt pocket is ready. Take a moment to admire it. time to move to the chest pockets. Take the flat pieces and pair them up, making sure the right sides are facing each other. Then pin the two pieces of each pair together, ensuring that the edges align properly. I like to mark the corners of the seam allowance so I can pivot exactly where I need to. You'll sew around the four sides of each pair with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Just be sure to leave the top edge open so you can turn the flap right side out later. To reduce bulk, we'll carefully trim one seam allowance in half and cut a triangle shape in the corners, making sure not to cut into the seam itself. To finish it off, let's turn it through to the right side and give it a good press with an iron to make sure it's nice and flat. Then you'll top stitch the flap around the four sides with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. This will give it a polished look and add some extra strength to the seams. Now, let's work on the chest pocket facing piece. If you have an overlocker, great. Use it to overlock the bottom hem of the facing piece. Don't have an overlocker? No worries. There's another way to get a neat finish. Start by pressing the bottom hem 1 centimeter to the wrong side. Once you've pressed the hem, it's time to top stitch it. Set your machine for a 0.8 centimeter seam and stitch along the hem. Let's unite the front piece and the chest pocket facing. Place them right sides together at the top, making sure those notches meet perfectly and pin in place. Start your sewing adventure at one of those notches. Drop down 2.5 centimeter and then follow the line of the pocket opening. Use a 1 centimeter seam allowance as your trusty guide. Once you've reached the second notch, make your way back up. Scissors at the ready? It's time for a little snip-snip action to give those corners the attention they deserve. Hold those scissors firmly and cut a clean, diagonal line super close to each corner. Now flip the pocket bag to the wrong side of the fabric and give it a really good press with an iron. Sew a top stitch at 0.5 centimeter all around the pocket opening, taking care to catch the facing in the seam also. It's time to mark out where your chest pocket will sit on the front piece of your garment. Take your front piece pattern and lay it over the fabric. Now, on the right side of the fabric, carefully trace the markings of the chest pocket. Make sure your markings are clear and accurate. Next up, grab your chest pocket lining. We're going to align it just right. Place the right side of the pocket lining against the wrong side of the front piece. As you position it, ensure that all the notches and markings you just made match up. Once everything is lined up, pin it in place. Now head over to your sewing machine. You're going to top stitch from the right side following the markings you traced earlier. This step is crucial. As you sew, ensure that you catch the pocket lining in the seam. Keep your stitching neat and on track with the markings. Let's add a bit more finesse to your chest pocket with a second top stitch. Sew a second line of top stitching on the inner side of your initial top stitch. Aim for a distance of 0.5 centimeter from the first line. Next, position the flap at the top of the pocket, right sides together between the notches. Make sure those straight edges are aligned. Ready to unite that front yoke and front pieces like they're meant to be? Place them right sides together, making sure that the edges are perfectly lined up and those trusty notches are matching. Keep an eye out to ensure that your pocket flap is in perfect position to meet the pocket opening. Once everything's in harmony, go ahead and sew them using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once you're done, give that seam a nice press upwards to keep everything looking crisp and neat. Last but not least, add that golden touch, a top stitch. Sew one at 0.5 centimeter from the seam on the bottom of the yoke, making sure to catch that seam allowance too. Take a moment to admire your front pieces. Congrats on your hard work. Let's move on to the back. Fold the fabric at the center back piece into 2 equal pleats following the pattern markings, bringing each side towards the sides. Pin the pleats in place, making sure they are of equal size and placement. Using a sewing machine, sew along the raw edge of the pleats using a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance to secure them in place. Press the pleats in place. Lay out the center back piece on your workspace, then place each side back piece over it, ensuring that the right sides of the fabric are facing each other. Carefully align the edges of these pieces. Take your time to match up the notches. Once you're happy with the alignment, pin the pieces in place. Now let's sew these pieces together. Set your sewing machine for a 1 centimeter seam allowance and stitch along the pinned edges. After sewing, it's time to press the seam. First, press the seam open and then aim to press it towards the center of the back piece. Finally, add a top stitch. From the right side of the fabric, sew a top stitch at 0.5 centimeter on the center back piece, making sure to catch the seam allowance underneath. Take the back yoke piece and align the bottom edge with the back piece with right sides facing each other. Pin the two pieces together, making sure the edges align properly. Sew the bottom edge of the yoke to the back piece using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam upwards towards the neck to ensure it lays flat. Top stitch on the back yoke at 0.5 centimeters just as we did previously. Align the shoulder and sides edges of the front and back pieces with right sides facing each other. Pin the two pieces together, making sure the edges align properly. Sew the shoulder and sides edges together using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam flat with an iron. Sew a top stitch on the yoke shoulder at 0.5 centimeter, catching the seam allowance also. We're now moving on to assembling the sleeves. First, take the top sleeve and the undersleeve pieces. Lay them out so that the right sides of the fabric are facing each other. Carefully align the edges of these pieces. Match up any notches or markings. Once everything is lined up neatly, pin the pieces together. Now it's time to sew. Stitch the top sleeve to the undersleeve, starting from the top and going down to where the vent marking is. Set your sewing machine for a 1.6 centimeter seam allowance. After sewing, grab your scissors for a little snip action. Trim down half the seam allowance on the top sleeve side. This reduces the bulk in the seam, making it lay flatter and look neater. All right, let's give those vents a nice, neat finish. Gently fold the undersleeve vent towards the right side 2 times following the notches. Press in place and pin, taking care that the folded edge aligns with the sleeve seam. Once you have it folded neatly, top stitch in place on the folded edge. Moving on to the upper sleeve vent, fold it 3 times to the wrong side of the fabric, following the notches. Press and pin in place. Next, let's work on the seam between the undersleeve and the top sleeve. Fold the seam allowance towards the sleeve seam. Then, fold the seam allowance again towards the top sleeve. Make sure the folded edge sits neatly along the edge of the vent. First, top stitch on the folded edge of the top sleeve vent. Place the folded seam allowance over the top sleeve vent, hiding the top part of the vent. Pin in place. Now, from the right side of the fabric, top stitch from the top all the way down to the vent, keeping the same seam allowance we used when we top stitched the vent. Take care that the top stitch is on the top sleeve part, and that you catch in the seam the folded seam allowance. Lastly, sew a small stitch across the vent at the end. This little stitch is super important. It's securing everything and enclosing the raw edge of the vent. And here you have it, a flat seam with vent. Give it a really good press with an iron. Let's move to the side seam of the sleeve. Time for a bit of sewing magic with a French seam. First, let's fold the sleeve with the wrong sides together. Pin in place. We're going to sew the raw edges together with a seam allowance of 0.7 centimeter. Once that's done, it's trimming time. Carefully trim down the seam allowance in half. Now for a bit of a flip. Turn the sleeve inside out so the right sides are now facing each other. Next up, give that edge a good press with your iron. Now pin again along this edge and sew keeping to our 0.7 centimeter seam allowance. This encases the raw edge inside the seam, like a secret hidden inside. And finally, press that seam one more time. Lay the jacket out flat with the right side facing up. Place the sleeve into the armhole with the right sides facing each other. Align the notches on the sleeve with the notches on the jacket and the underarm seams. Sew along the edges of the sleeve and armhole, attaching the sleeve to the bodice, using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Grab the cuff pieces and let's put them to work. You're going to fold the top part of the cuffs inward. It's a small fold, just 1 centimeter. Make sure to fold towards the wrong side of the fabric. Next, you'll need to fold the cuff in half lengthwise, right sides facing each other. Sew them along the edges with the top part folded. After sewing, trim the corners at an angle. Once you've done that, it's time to flip the cuffs right side out and give them a good press. Grab your outer cuff piece and place it on the bottom of the sleeve. They should be placed with their right sides facing each other. Once they're perfectly aligned, pin the two pieces together, making sure the edges are perfectly matched. Now it's time to sew. Using your trusty sewing machine, join the bottom of the sleeve to the top of the outer cuff. Make sure to keep a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Take the undercuff piece and turn under the seam allowance, so it is hidden on the inside of the cuff. Pin the undercuff in place around the cuff edge, making sure the seam allowance is inserted inside the cuff and the two leading front edges are symmetrical. Use a flat top stitch to securely attach the undercuff to the cuff edge. Sew at a distance of 0.1 centimeter from the edge. Sew a second top stitch at 0.5 centimeter from the first one and continue around the whole cuff. Let's move our focus on the collar. We're going to unite the upper and under collar by sewing them together. Here's how. First, align them with their right sides facing each other and pin in place around the side and outside edge. You will notice that the under collar is slightly smaller than the upper collar. All you have to do is to pull the under collar to fit. The slight size difference helps the collar roll naturally towards the underside. This rolling effect helps the collar sit neatly and aesthetically on the neck. Then sew in place using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now for a dash of precision. When you approach the corners, sew a sharp point by smoothly pivoting. Next, trim the seam allowance from the undercollar. Then say goodbye to the surplus fabric at the corners. Once you've done that, turn the collar to the right side and push out the corners. And for that extra touch of perfection, press the collar gently. Last but not least, it's time to top stitch all around the collar. Here's a nifty trick. Use the edge of your machine foot as a guide. Now bring the raw edges of the top and under collar together and top stitch at 0.5 centimeters, taking care to align the edges. Align the notches on the undercollar with those on the jacket's neckline edge and secure them in place with sewing pins, right sides together. Stitch the collar to the bodice along the pinned neckline edge, using a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. Take the back lining piece and locate the folds on the center back edge of the neckline. Fold them in place towards the center and top stitch in place using a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. I went with a different approach. I folded the lining in half, aligned the notches, and sewed 2 centimeters down. Then folded the pleat in 2 equal parts and top stitched the top at 0.5 centimeters. Let's bring together the front and back lining pieces for a cozy inside to your garment. Start by pairing them up, right sides together. Once they're all cozied up, sew along the shoulders and the side seams, using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. After you've sewn these seams, it's time for a little ironing session. Gently press those seams open with your iron. Place the back-facing and front-facing pieces with their right sides together, ensuring that the shoulder edges are precisely aligned. Secure this alignment with sewing pins. Sew along the aligned shoulder edges to join the facing pieces. After removing the pins, press the seams open using an iron. Take the lining and the facing of the jacket and lay them with their right sides facing each other. Before pinning, ensure that the shoulder seams of the lining align perfectly with those of the main jacket fabric. Use sewing pins to secure this alignment along the edges. Once everything is properly positioned, sew along the pinned edges to attach the lining to the facing. After removing the pins, press the seam in the direction of the lining. Now guess who lost the bobbin battle? Me. Quick inspection to check that everything is okay. Let's bring together your main fabric jacket piece and the facing plus lining combo. Place them with their right sides together. In the middle of this fabric sandwich, you'll have the collar. It's the star of the show, neatly tucked in between. Now, it's time to play matchmaker with all the notches and edges. Carefully align them. Double-check that everything is in harmony, with no puckers or mismatches. Once you're happy with the alignment, pin everything in place. Starting from one end, begin sewing all the way around the jacket's edges to attach the facing to the main fabric. Remember to use a consistent seam allowance. Staying on the path is key. Leave the bottom edge unsewn for now. After sewing, it's time to trim the excess fabric at the corners. Be cautious and gentle. You want to cut enough to help the facing lay flat when the jacket is worn, but not so close that you threaten the seam's integrity. It's also a good idea to cut little snips around the collar seam allowance, taking care not to pass the seam. All right, it's time to turn your jacket right side out, like unveiling a masterpiece. Gently ease it through until everything is facing the right way. Now let's give those seams some attention with your iron. Pressing is key here. Take your time and press each seam really well. Sew a top stitch at the bottom of the jacket. Align the shell fabric and the lining wrong sides together and top stitch at 0.5 centimeters. It's easier to sew the waistband later this way. Then align the armhole of the lining with the armhole of the jacket. Keep them wrong sides facing each other. Carefully match the notches as you pin the armholes together. Once everything is pinned, sew them together with a seam allowance of 0.5 centimeter. Apply bias tape to give a clean and decorative finish to the armhole seam. Wrap the bias tape around the seam, pinning and sewing it as you go. It's a bit more time-consuming, but adds a lovely touch to the inside of your jacket. You can always overlock the seam if you are not confident in sewing the bias tape. Grab the waistband piece and you're going to fold the top part inward 1 centimeter, just as we did with the cuffs. Next, you'll need to fold the waistband in half lengthwise, right sides facing each other. Sew it along the edges using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Don't forget to trim the corners at an angle. Once you've done that, it's time to flip the waistband right side out and give it a good press. Just as we did with the cuffs, align the outer waistband piece and place it on the bottom of the jacket. They should be placed with their right sides facing each other. Once they're perfectly aligned, pin the pieces together, making sure the hem edges are perfectly matched. Join them using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam allowance towards the waistband. Take the under waistband and turn under the seam allowance, so it is hidden on the inside of the waistband. Pin the under waistband in place around the hem, making sure the seam allowance is inserted inside the waistband and the 2 leading front edges are symmetrical. Use a flat top stitch to securely attach the under waistband to the hem edge. Sew at a distance of 0.1 centimeter from the edge. Sew a second top stitch at 0.5 centimeter from the first top stitch, and continue around the whole waistband. I'm not going to record the sewing because it's the same as we did with the cuffs. Let's add some beautiful top stitching detail to your jacket. You're going to sew a top stitch 4 centimeters away from the center front edges. Think of it as drawing a neat line parallel to the edge, adding both strength and style to your jacket. Mark it first with chalk or pen. As you sew this top stitch, make sure you're also catching the facing in the seam. It holds everything in place and looks great too. It's the little details like this that really make your garment stand out. Here comes the grand finale for your jacket. Adding buttons and buttonholes. Following the markings on the pattern, trace the buttonholes on the right side of the jacket and sew them. Then add the snaps or buttons on the left side of the jacket. Don't forget about the cuffs. And voila, your jacket is ready. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon.